So thank you all very much for the chance to be back here today. I was in grad school at Stanford some time ago, and it's a real pleasure to get to talk. What Sally didn't mention is that the big event going on that night, from my memory, at the California Academy of Sciences is that while we spoke in a very nice first floor room, it was date night for 20-year-olds upstairs. And so the amount of techie necking going on in the upstairs was pretty intense, is what my memory of trying to get out of that. So I have the kind of the fun, and I hope I can do some justice to the breadth of the topic today, which is really to look at what are the innovations taking place and what are the opportunities in the wider set of innovations in industrializing. I use developing economies, developing countries, that's the title, but really industrializing in many ways is more accurate, both in terms of the upside and the downside. And so what I'm going to try to do is to reflect a little bit of the innovation agenda which is taking place. It is happening by many means, by many metrics, faster there than here for reasons we'll talk about in a bit. And I'll end up with a number of kind of opportunities to engage on a variety of topics and to remind myself, I will put one of the example devices on the table here. And so in terms of what I want to try to cover, there's a couple things. One is that, as we've heard in all of the speakers from the scientific side, from Chad's perspective, from Sally's perspective in terms of the transition, we're all here because we recognize and know that a transition is needed now. But there's also a number of critical fallacies that are in place that are actually slowing us down. One is that low-cost fossil fuels is one route and green energy is another, and all of the GCEP projects, it's a remarkable, diverse set of efforts. I really commend Stanford for having on campus and an international set of partners. I think it's a really unique and critical way to build out the efforts that are needed, but that this is a false dichotomy. The fact that fossil fuel systems are cheaper is largely a holdover of the metrics that we use and don't use properly in this area. And in fact, when I was at the World Bank for a year running the renewable energy and energy efficiency programs, I would often hear from people pushing back that we shouldn't do research on the development dime or development dollar. Also a false perspective, because many of these projects are innovating in the lab and in the field much faster in these emerging economies. The other one is that developing countries are technology takers from places like this, and that's also false. And when you look at what's actually happening in terms of basic kind of Nobel Prize type of innovations and innovations in the field, that story is just simply false. And there are some really critical aspects of that thinking that we need to disabuse ourselves. The other feature, which does apply differently in developing countries than in the US and parts of Europe, is that we critically need off-grid and on-grid agendas to work together. And that's everything from research to deployment. And I'll use Kenya as an example place where there is some action on that, but this is really a global story, and I'll just highlight some of those opportunities as we go ahead. The other one is that financing is available, but too often it's on the sidelines for a whole variety of reasons. Developing country projects can be harder to find. There can be seeming bureaucratic barriers. There's this kind of ongoing fear of graft, and what we call graft in Kenya, here we just call institutional practice often. And so making sure that we recognize what the opportunities are. I may be sensitive on this. My wife is Nigerian, and every time we talk about Nigeria as the capital of corruption, Wole Soyinka likes to say that in a country where little is happening at the state level, a lot of this fine, innovative capacity goes into kind of not so desirable practices. Well, here, we've institutionalized some of those practices, and so we should recognize how innovative many of these economies are. And the other feature, and it sounds like nerdy bookkeeping, but I'm a nerd, and so that feature is that if we don't do proper accounting of the resources, we simply won't send clear messages to industry, public sector, private sector, NGOs. And so I'm going to end with a real clear call, I hope, for doing that accounting better, and where we don't know how to do it, making that agenda. That was Chris's last slide on going back to 2010 and instituting a carbon price, but not just a carbon price. A whole variety of environmental and social damaging costs have to enter the equation. In terms of the range of types of projects, I will focus on the science to a fair degree. I'm a physicist who's worked on these topics for a number of decades now. But the opportunity to build new types of innovative collaborations is in many ways the feature most lacking. And so as a program that I'm the co-director of this year, it's this year jointly sponsored by the US government and the Brazilian government. It's a program that supports 20 fellows from across the Americas, 5 US, 5 Brazilian, 10 from other countries in a competition, and they are then put into 2-year, 5-person teams. We just had that meeting in Brazilian São Paulo a few weeks ago, and they then run on projects from off-grid energy systems to the social science aspect of energy accounting, to the role of local innovation around biofuels, and those teams are a really interesting example of international collaboration that supports and sustains the researchers all around the Americas. And so one of the key features that I would like to see the kind of discussions here, not just on the graphs and science, as Sally highlighted in the beginning, but what are the ways for universities to step up, for Stanford, Berkeley, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, Humboldt State, a whole variety of places to say, we would like to push the US embassies in countries where we're active. We would like to push the State Department to find ways to make these programs not just the Americas, but globally. An example of that is something started by President Obama in 2009, and it's the ECPA program. It's the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas. It started off with 3 fellows. I was chosen by Secretary of State Clinton as the Energy Fellow. There was a Water and a Land Use Fellow. I went into a bit of a quiet period when I was at the World Bank for a year. I was reappointed by Secretary Kerry, and now we've gone to a cohort of 20 fellows that work in a variety of projects, mainly initiating and then working to sustain university, industry, government, university collaborations, in this case all across the Americas, but again, the mandate is to expand that picture. This is just a kind of 2 slides from a press conference in the embassy in Managua, and then some field projects on the autonomous Atlantic coast, where there's quite a strong push on off-grid, mini-grid systems. I won't highlight the imperative around the climate transition. We heard a brilliant version of that from Chris in the beginning. We heard that that guardrail, that 2-degree C line is critical, but it's soft. There are risks both above and below the guardrail, but it is a target. And one of the things that we've lacked are targets to really focus activity around, something I'll come back to in the comments that Chad made. But all of the risks you see on that thermometer picture on the right, something that Unit of Concerned Scientists really made popular, is all of those risks are more severe in emerging nations. The capacity to respond, the depth of infrastructure is in general less, and so finding opportunities to support these efforts is a critical part of the story. The other piece, the other sort of denominator, if you will, before I get into the meat of the talk, is that the energy systems are growing much more rapidly in developing countries than developing countries. And the best time to install new innovations, from efficiency to end-use opportunities to renewable technology to smarter grids, is at the point of deployment, something we've learned very well with all of the process around building codes and lead ratings. And so it is a critical part of the story. And so making developing countries not the takers because we don't collaborate, but the drivers is a critical part of the equation. That overall picture to meet the 2-degree C guardrail, there's lots of ways to lay it out. One version is the business as usual path of emissions. And then the projected forward Energy Information Agency, the US Department of Energy's projected path ahead. And then what we should have passed through if we'd adopted the Kyoto Protocol with all of its warts and flaws. That's that orange triangle for which we should have passed our emissions pathway through, which we did not do. Recognizing that what we heard from Chris is that we need to be in this green zone before 2050. Something that sounds like a radical transformation. It is going to be challenging. I actually don't think it's as hard as it seems, but the if-then statement is going to be critical to get there. I can connect where we are and where we should be. It doesn't take much analytic skills to do so. But this path of passing back through our 1990 baseline by 2020, that's the California standard. California is by all measures ahead of pace to get there, despite a whole range of challenges that exist now and surely will continue going forward. And just to put it in perspective, the European nations have differentiated targets. They are generally from 20 to 40% below that 1990 baseline, so that's passing through the blue box on there. I'm a little bit skeptical that European nations collectively are going to make it. Some certainly will, but I think that in many ways there are some challenges in their perspective on this. But it is a critical place to go in setting these standards and then developing the R&D programs to meet them, not the other way around. Not saying what path are we on an innovation picture, and then developing targets from that has got to be one of those steps going forward. My time at the World Bank was focused around writing the World Bank's energy strategy, which we wrote under then World Bank President Bob Zoellick. We called for a number of things, but the bumper sticker versions were that we needed to make carbon accounting an internal business requirement of the bank. There needed to be a unit of the bank focused on household energy, because that's something that we lack in many research and employment settings. That the bank had to be much more of a do tank, meaning not just deploying ideas financed elsewhere, but it needed to innovate around the needs in developing countries, and there needed to be a moratorium on coal lending. All of these were blocked at the ultimate decision level at the bank under President Zoellick. All of these have been adopted in various forms under new President Kim. A report that President Kim commissioned, the 4 degrees C report, was a compromise between no upper end target and that 2-degree guardrail we heard Chris talk about. And notice that the most critical part of this whole report, this was written by PIC, the Potsdam Climate Institute, is actually on the front page of the report, meaning if you don't read the whole thing, at least read the cover. And the cover said why a 4 degrees warming world must be avoided. So put up front the goal in this process. When we look at the California story, we have the black being where we've been, the gray being that business as unacceptable, but business as forecast. And then the green path, and California has a very interesting and challenging story about how to get there, but we are on pace. And would we like the carbon price to be different than today? Perhaps. Would we like to see less of a pushback around applying the carbon price to transportation fuels? Yes, yes, and yes. But by all measures, we are making progress, and the next parts of the discussion, which I'll get to in a bit, highlight many of the opportunities in developing countries. I will not repeat what Chris did. I think the critical part of the story in terms of thinking about the IPCC process is that there were a series of science-based metrics, kind of the world that Chris and I and others in the room, Arun, came from in terms of our training. But translating that into actionable statements, I think, is the real brilliance of the IPCC. I won't go through each one, but each of the reports, the first assessment report in 1990, second assessment report, you can see the vertical lines showing when these things happen, the second assessment report, the third assessment report, all added greater and greater clarity to the role of human activity, anthropogenic climate change, the living in the Anthropocene world that we talk about now. And it's really in the next report, in the third and then the fourth assessment, that I thought things began to move into that actionable world. And the 2 key statements for me is that warming very clearly tied to human activity, and then what I think is the transformative statement in this process, and that is the warming will most strongly and most quickly impact the global poor. Didn't say just poorest nations. It didn't say Chad and Nicaragua, forget it. But it said that the poor worldwide, and there's obviously more of the poor in poor countries, are going to be affected first. And so we need a new sort of research agenda. The special report on renewable energy came out in 2011, a report for which I was one of the co-lead authors on the integrative policy chapter, came up with a statement that looking at the range of technologies and resources, that 80% reduction goal that I've described is achievable. The problem is, it's an if-then statement that a Fortran 77 programmer would need to love. I mean, it's an if-then with 90 pages of if this, if that. And it's taking that, we can do it, but these challenges are daunting, to an action plan that Chad and others highlighted and that we need to focus on today. Fifth assessment report out now highlights the story more clearly, and again, I won't do more of that because Cliff highlighted it. I mean, Chris highlighted it. In terms of thinking about an actionable version, let me start again with California, and then again I'll look at Kenya and elsewhere. And a version of that story is the version that every elected politician in California knows. They may not agree on all the details, but the idea that our business as usual path will result in a box of emissions by 2050 is not something confined to the technical advisor or the academic consultant or the white paper writer. It is something that if you ask any member of California's Assembly or the Senate, they will recognize and talk about. You may disagree with them on the details, but the idea that that's our emissions trajectory, and that in this particular environment, with excellent renewable energy resources, with an aggressive landscape of policies, with a very green electorate, there's a strategy to not only shrink that box by 80%, but to shift the overall picture in two critical ways. One is to constrict the amount of liquid fuels and electricity by being more efficient, both on our stationary power, end-use power, and vehicles. So crushing down the sides, if you will, to use less fuels and electricity. And then to decarbonize the overall picture leads to a whole set of policies that more or less can be boiled down to a simple picture like this. There's lots of details not told in that kind of story, but it gives a clear graphical version. And the critical piece that comes out of this kind of understanding how things fit together, this has not been captured in the international negotiations. We're hoping this will change by Paris. And that is, the different actions need to hang together. And it's much easier to defend a policy to decarbonize fuels if you can see how it's also related to a strategy to, for example, give back gains that come in terms of greater efficiency to business and end users. If I unpack that complicated picture, or that simplified picture, for California, you get a very intricate timeline that has things like renewable energy standards. We have a 33% standard for renewable energy by 2020. That does not include nuclear. That does not include large hydro. Other states include them in different ways. We also have requirements for 1 million electric vehicles and 1 million solar rooftops, probably not all the same, but some level overlap. When you lay it out, this gives real breath of life to this kind of simplified picture of what goes together in that strategy. And this translation is where the kind of science and the kind of science to policy that we're doing here is so critical. This is not unique to California. This is the exact same picture of Kenya's equally dense policy landscape. Kenya is largely hydropower driven today. Kenya also sees climate change as dramatically affecting that hydro base. Geothermal is now the cheapest form of new dispatchable energy in Kenya, and so the nation is on an official national strategy to basically swap that 60% baseload hydropower, which they see as becoming increasingly irregular or non-dispatchable, and replace that with baseload geothermal, now fleshed out with a whole variety of other sources. Solar and wind, and I'll come back to those in a little bit. Kenya, like California, sees also tremendous amounts of unconventional fossil fuels. There is an exploration boom going on right now for conventional and unconventional gas and oil, so they're grappling with many of the same challenges. But the Prime Minister has announced a 2050 target, exactly similar to California's. Kenya also is in the global lead in using mobile online information to manage the energy transition. I'll come back to that in a second. I won't do in detail today, just because of time, the very clear story around the connection between energy access and a whole variety of economic drivers and quality of life. There's a paper coming out in Nature Climate Change in a couple of weeks that highlights across countries, across regions, very clear information that links the so-called Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, number of women that get through school, the access to healthcare, all kinds of things that correlate with, not necessarily caused by, but correlate with increased energy access. That story sets up a need to dramatically move this agenda forward. While California doesn't worry about energy access, Kenya does. Kenya has this dramatically cleaning national energy mix, but only 30% of Kenyans are on grid. So they need another part of that equation, and this is typical for many developing countries. A picture of how serious that story is that off-grid liquid and solid fuel-based lighting systems are the norm in much of the world. In Africa alone, kerosene is a $10 billion industry. It is a dominant part of the household energy landscape. It comes with economic exposure to fossil fuels, issues of burning, bad indoor air quality, and yet we now have this innovation-based revolution, devices like this that use solar and batteries and LED lights and all manner of kind of cleverly tied together items to change that landscape. So when you look at what off-grid lighting services can do, they change the innovation platform in a way that I'll come back and mention in a second. Information technology is critical in selling these devices. It also provides, in a part of the world where consumer reports is not the thing you read every day, it provides a way to get information on systems that work and that don't work. Customers are very price sensitive, no surprise if you're earning only a few dollars a day. Once people recognize high quality products, they sell dramatically quickly, and that this is a process that can lead to not only good products going quickly, but if you have the ability to get bad quality solar panels, batteries that don't work, small gasifiers that don't work out of the market, you can really get quality control. And that's something that our lab has been engaged with in getting people to get these better devices in place. A feature that we don't hear talked about all the time, and I think is actually the missing piece, and it's largely because the story I've told so far, is largely a physical science and economic analysis of energy options, both developed and developing countries, but it's not a recognition of the business opportunities. When you look at the fuel-based lighting picture compared to the LED lighting picture, this is simply a better product. It's not just that it's green versus that it's dirty energy, it is simply better. We don't do anywhere enough developing of technologies where the renewable energy option outperforms the fossil option. And that's a failure of this whole effort around clean energy to really see the market side of the story. And what that adds up to is something that was alluded to in Chad's talk, and that is when you look at the number of people around the world who do not have access to even basic energy services, it's about 1.2 or 1.3 billion people today. About another billion don't have access to reliable or affordable services, and the global forecast is that by 2030, nothing much will have changed. And so we are on a path to failure. More people will have access, but as population rises, we will not have made significant progress. Another way to think about that is if you kind of look at this in terms of that unserved billion compared to total population, it's remained roughly constant, unacceptable for all of these benefits of energy access and benefits of clean, rapidly deployable access stories that are out there. The lurking story we heard Chad talk about, we heard Sally talk about it, is that cell phone information technology has really transformed that equation. That was one of the motivators for the effort that Chad highlighted, and that is that Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General, here we have him next to Jim Kim, President of the World Bank, and Kandi Yumkella from West Africa, announcing 2012 was initially the year of energy access for all, and now it's become the decade of access for all, where access for everyone by 2030 is the goal, doubling the deployment of energy efficiency, doubling the deployment of renewables are all on that agenda to really transform that equation. The research plan to get there is very challenging, but in sort of a positive example of that is that initial collaborations between the US Department of Energy and the World Bank, the IFC at the World Bank, developed a Lighting Africa program based around these very simple types of devices that was really decried by many people as not an acceptable strategy. You're not going to electrify households with very simple devices. Actually, the story is quite different in terms of when those programs began. Lighting and other services was only the beginning of a platform. Quality assurance was part of it. Getting larger and larger amounts of services from small amounts of energy, taking advantage of LED lights. Now we have these small distributed systems that also have everything from lighting to radios to cell phone charging, now color TVs, DC refrigerators and freezers, all powered off of micro-sized systems. That wasn't one single advance. This is very much the energy efficiency story, where a commitment to a goal overall has enabled a platform. And the energy innovation competitions that go on around the world, all universities now have them, have found that these very simple platforms around lighting products have really changed the game, where you started off with what seemed like a glorified flashlight, no longer true. It is now a large-scale effort to get clean technologies in place, taking advantage of the learning curve not only for solar, but also for LED lights and batteries. Putting that together has been the challenge. A project that we did in Nicaragua 4 years ago put together a package of innovations. The community took it on, and they didn't have a plan for 2030. They had a 24-month plan, which they achieved. They have now become a small community on the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua, not exactly a very developed or often thought of region as an innovation in energy systems, but they now export this through a variety of World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank programs to find ways to build and sustain mini-grids, something that we wrote up in a recent report for the UN Foundation looking at the status of those systems today and the rapid expansion of off-grid and mini-grid systems that start to pull together all of these different technologies. Now, if I harken back to the California story very briefly, the technology mix or the technology leaders have changed dramatically. Go back 10 years and there was a thought that the hydrogen highway and dramatically large deployment of biofuels might be the big transition element. If you ask people in California government today, it's the picture I showed you before, with a huge ramp up of solar, a big ramp up of wind, dramatic improvements in efficiency, and all of that has led to a picture where you start to see huge push towards clean energy, so much so that today California's discussion about its 2030 renewable energy standard is in the range of 45 to 50%, not the 33% we are already on pace for 2020. And then you have to remember that does not include nuclear power, does not include large hydro, both of which have challenges and issues, but they increase the amount of zero or really low carbon energy in the mix. Part of the story Chris alluded to in the first talk was that we have to be flexible about surprises. And so one of the key features is that as more IPCC and other science comes in, what we see is that we're likely to need to have to go even further than 80%. The scenarios that California has mandated are things that look at scenarios that go carbon negative. And Sally alluded to these with the biofuel coal partnerships. These are opportunities to switch the sign so we're not talking about 80% decarbonization, but more if we need to get there. In this process, California is now the home of the world's largest solar thermal facility, the world's largest thin film project, the world's largest wind farm, a resurgence in manufacturing in the United States of electric vehicles. Roughly half of all EVs in the country are deployed in California. Amusingly, California's 2020 EV target is the same as the federal government's. I'd like to see the federal target being a few incremental vehicles beyond California's target. But all of that leads to a picture which is also deployable in developing countries. Kenya, on this transition to clean energy, sees geothermal as its new baseload. And in fact, the largest geothermal facility in Kenya is now the most active exploration and deployment site for geothermal in the world, eclipsing Iceland in terms of new explorations right now. At the same time, Kenya built a trial wind farm just south of Nairobi in the Ngong Hills. You can see that on the picture on the left. That wind farm was a trial for what is now being built behind Lake Turkana here in the backside of that picture. That's where Africa's largest wind farm is going. Enabling this commitment to clean energy deployment has been a very different process. Kenya has been, along with China and India, probably the three most innovative places in terms of research done by Kenyans and international partners around cook stoves, around ways to do slum electrification, not a great term, but the concept is there. And then this mobile money that has allowed people to buy off-grid energy services has become part of this equation, which has changed the picture of where we're going. mobile money, originally for banking, is now projected to be dominated by off-grid energy services as we go forward. This process of innovation in developing countries is not exclusively a process for which we think around developed country leaders. The Philippines were a lead innovator in getting biomass-powered electric vehicles as a downtown resource for shared taxis. That effort then led into a program to electrify these vehicles. The person who was the political sponsor of this effort was, at that point, the president of Makati, downtown Manila, now the vice president of the country. All of those efforts have led to opportunities to innovate around science and technology and to use those efforts to build models of the on-grid clean energy system and the off-grid system. That's the partnership we need going forward. The last piece of the story is the one I mentioned in the beginning, and that is that financing is critically important, and that there's a great deal of financing on the sidelines. And so Felix Kramer, who is here in the room, and I have written a series of recent op-eds and pieces highlighting the amount of overseas capital that large US companies have that could be deployed in for-profit, for green energy opportunities to bring these technologies into practice. And when you look at what we've seen in Kenya, the initial skepticism about these off-grid products, the need to build out a clean energy grid, as I've highlighted, what this, I hope, quickly kind of brings together is that there is an innovation agenda dramatically more aggressive in developing countries where the need is high, where unelectrified people are in large numbers, that this community has some tendrils into, but hasn't done anywhere near enough, because not only are the technology challenges kind of research worthy, if you will, but the deployment challenges highlight areas that we haven't even begun to build partnerships. And so I thank you for the time to talk today, and I hope what comes out of this is really a larger focus on the researchers, both in universities, at industry, and governments, NGOs around the world, that are finding this space of innovation for clean energy and energy access really the place that we need to focus a great deal more attention than we're doing today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Two questions. I had one question, then the last thing you just said. Are you talking about not repatriating that money, but using it where it is to do the clean energy investment? Is that the idea of
that would be the idea, that with roughly $2 trillion overseas, that even a small amount of that, where some companies could step up and say, we want to partner with those pilot companies. When I showed, for example, the picture of this mobile money in Kenya, this is an effort, we're not on the slides anymore, but that mobile money process has enabled an information-savvy approach to these off-grid products. That's not only an opportunity to bring energy access, but it's actually a great investment opportunity. The company we work with in Kenya has, over 6 months, gone from 25 to 50 to 100,000 off-grid customers that pay less than $1 a day with mobile money to then own these systems. And so there's a huge opportunity for companies that want to take a look at this kind of effort to then say, we could do good and do well by investing in this space.
So my original question is about the CO2 that's already up there. It's been mentioned a couple of times already. What do you see as ways that people are being innovative of dealing with the CO2 up in the atmosphere already? Obviously, if you get to where you want to go by 2050, there'll be less being produced, but we've got a lot up there already.
Right, so two approaches to this. One is that so what you're asking about is the adaptation mitigation agenda. What mix do we do in these? And my view on this is that as much as we discover we're going to need to mitigate, potentially geoengineer, an area that I'm not a huge fan of, but I know that's not the right word over here, that's something we might need. But we have a huge opportunity to make the problem easier going down the line by much more aggressively deploying these clean energy systems. And so one thing that's come out of the work in our laboratory is that we've built a series of models of the energy economy of regions. We have a version of this model called Switch for Western North America, a version for China, Nicaragua, Chile. We're releasing the version for India in a few months. Each of those models come up with a very interesting and consistent story, and that is, if you have control or the right levers to deploy clean energy generation, efficient use and transport of that, and then deployment, it's not that hard a story. What's hard about it is that we do not coordinate well those investments today. And we don't make clear that if we're going to try to incentivize a large wind farm or geothermal or solar field, whether it's in rural California or Kenya, that that has to come with the investor certainty that the transmission network to bring it to market is going to be there. All of those models that I built all basically say the same thing, and that is between about $40 a ton and $50 a ton for CO2, all of these economies, including the 800-pound gorilla in the room, China, all decarbonize. $40 may sound like a very high number in DC. China already has spot prices for carbon at 20. California is a little over 10. So this is not that far away. And we're talking about numbers we need basically by 2030 to see all of those big systems. And so in the first talk, we had a question about the top 15 countries. We actually think that if you take the China and the US version, that two-nation negotiation really gets you there already. And so I really do see there's a lot of opportunities to deploy these systems, but you've got to have that kind of coordination we don't have today.
Okay, we'll go way back in the far back, and then we'll go to you.
So I was looking at your analysis for the California's projections, but California imports quite a bit of its energy from neighboring states from coal-fired power plants. So does that analysis only account for electricity that's produced within the state, or does it also account for the fact that it's pulling a lot of its power from power plants outside the state?
Right, so great question. So that's why you have to analyze the system that is, not some idealized version. The models that we do, the models that the National Renewable Energy Lab do for California recognize it's embedded in the West. And so drawing an isolated box around California is cheating. California at peak imported about 24% of its electricity in terms of out-of-state coal. California's AB 32 calls for all of that to be removed from the system by 2020. California's target doesn't say no coal. What it says is that the emissions of a standard natural gas plant are our dirtiest member, and you've got to get under that. And whether that's by switching to renewables or by sequestering carbon, that's the choice of you as a generator. But to sell into the California market, you've got to be part of that low carbon club. And so that's where the regional economy story is critical in California. It's actually the same story in Kenya. Kenya signed an agreement to build a transmission corridor financed by the World Bank to connect Ethiopia and Kenya. That corridor was rerouted. It took a lot of work to go through that new wind farm I highlighted. And it has now been a process that has resulted in both Kenya and Ethiopia committing to have a feed-in tariff, the preferred European model for financing renewables. That wouldn't have happened without the hardware, but the hardware didn't guarantee the policy story. And so it's very similar to us importing clean energy from neighboring states and seeing that coal fraction go down and by forecast, hit 0 in 2020.
Okay, unfortunately, I think we need to wrap up and move on, but thank you
Very good.
very much.
Thanks so much.